Hey, welcome. Today we're diving into Nomi Prince's book, Collusion, and it makes a pretty explosive argument that after the 2008 financial crisis, central bankers basically colluded to rig the global economy. They saved the system, sure, but as we'll see, the public ended up paying the price.
Now, our guide through this, Nomi Prins, isn't some outsider just looking in. Oh no, she was a managing director at Goldman Sachs before she walked away from Wall Street. And this quote, well, it tells you everything you need to know about why she wrote this book. It's a story she says is about a system that's taken all of us hostage. So let's start at the very beginning of the crisis.
All right, let's set the stage. We're going back to 2008, a time when the entire global financial system was staring right into the abyss.
Now, according to Prince, the seeds of the 2008 crisis were actually planted way back in 1999. That's when the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed. And that's a big deal, because it tore down the firewall between your regular, everyday commercial banking and the high-risk world of investment banking. The result? These new, too-big-to-fail megabanks that spent the next decade taking on insane risks, building this huge mountain of toxic assets, all built on bad mortgages. And when that mountain finally crumbled in 2008, it triggered a global earthquake. You could feel the panic. In just 1 week, in October 2008, the Dow Jones just cratered, dropping 18%. That's its worst week in history. The whole system was in an absolute free fall, and you better believe the world's financial leaders were terrified. Their response would literally change the global economy forever. So this brings us to their response, and this is where things get really wild. Prins calls what they built the money conjuring machine.
The main tool in their toolbox was something called quantitative easing, or just QE. Now, it sounds super complicated, right? But the book breaks it down really simply. Prince calls it artisanal money, basically money created out of thin air by central banks. They then use this brand new cash to buy up things like government bonds, which is supposed to pump money into the financial system and get things moving again.
So how does this magic trick actually work? Well, it's pretty much a three-step dance. First, central banks literally just create billions of dollars on their computers. Poof, it exists. Then, they use that newly created money to buy assets from the big private banks. This floods those banks with cash, and the idea is that they're supposed to then lend that money out and, stimulate the real economy.
And the scale of this, it's just mind-boggling. In one single meeting, the leaders of the G20 agreed to inject $2 trillion into the global economy. What started as an emergency fix was about to become the new normal for the next decade. But here's the thing, not everyone was on board. Even way back in 2009, you had leaders like Germany's Angela Merkel sounding the alarm. She warned that if they didn't return to a policy of reason, they'd be right back in the same mess 10 years later. Turns out, she pretty much nailed it. Now, this massive flood of money didn't just stay put. It washed over the entire planet and, in the process, helped create a new world order. You see, this conjured money didn't just hang around in the US and Europe. Speculators used all this cheap cash to chase bigger profits in emerging markets. This sent these giant waves of capital crashing into countries like Brazil and Mexico, which inflated their currencies. And then, just as quickly, all that money would rush out, causing devastating economic crashes. The West was in effect exporting instability.
And this is where Prince presents a really fascinating contrast. While the West was pushing this short-term speculative model, what you might call hot money, China saw the crisis as a huge opportunity. It started offering developing nations a completely different kind of deal. Not speculative cash, but long-term partnerships to build real things, like ports and railways. This was a direct challenge to the entire Western-led system. And the result of this? Well, it was a geopolitical earthquake. Just look at the trade between China and Latin America. It went from $10 billion in 2000 to $270 billion by 2012. That's incredible. China became the #1 trading partner for countries like Brazil, which for decades had been seen as America's backyard. So while the West was frantically busy saving its own financial system, China was playing the long game. It launched massive infrastructure projects, created its own development banks, and started pushing its currency on the world stage. The 2008 crisis massively accelerated a power shift from the West to the East. But what about all the ordinary people back in the US and Europe? Well, that brings us to the final and maybe most important part of the author's argument, the immense price the people paid for all this. This quote from a Red Cross report in 2013, it just hits you in the gut. It really captures the human cost. While the headlines were screaming about a recovery in the financial markets, a totally different story was playing out on the ground for millions of people. The book calls it a tale of two recoveries, and it's a stark contrast. For the financial sector, the party was back on, big time. Bank profits went through the roof, CEO bonuses came roaring back, and the stock market soared. But for the general public, it was a decade of pain, with wages going nowhere in the US and just brutal government austerity measures in Europe. And the cost for the next generation was just staggering. By 2015, youth unemployment in parts of Europe was at catastrophic levels. I mean, look at Greece. More than half of their young people couldn't find a job. Prins argues it was a lost decade for an entire generation, basically sacrificed to save the banks. And this wasn't just an economic story. Of course not. The book draws a direct line from that widespread feeling of being left behind to the populist anger that fueled huge political earthquakes like Brexit and the 2016 US presidential election. When people feel like the system is rigged against them, eventually they're going to vote to smash it. So, what's the final verdict? Well, the coordinated actions by central banks, they did stop a complete meltdown in 2008. But the solution, a decade of this conjured money, has, in Prince's view, created a new, deeply unstable normal. It saved the banks, but it shattered public trust and may have set us up for even bigger crises down the road. Which brings us to the final, really unsettling question. After a decade of pushing interest rates to near zero and pumping trillions of dollars of artisan money into the system, what tools do central banks even have left? What happens when the next crisis hits and the fire hoses are already empty? That's the legacy of collusion that we are all living with right now.